Right, everybody, we'll start, if that's okay. I love the way Jack introduced himself. He was so powerful, wasn't he? I mean, you just immediately, whoa, Jack. Jack's got the stage, yeah? I'm Graeme Lamb. Many old friends here. Most of you will be disappointed to see that I'm still alive. But I am, luckily, joined on this stage by a powerful group of individuals who actually know what they're talking about. And from the United States, obviously from Israel, and in fact, James will struggle to try and put the British piece together, but I have every confidence that he'll impress CGS for his next star. They will answer the question. I, on the other hand, am a bit like Turner. My part in their downfall is merely to put one or two or three bright, violent, red brushstrokes onto their canvas, to just get your headspace to where it should be on the challenge where CGS put us this morning. We should have had Mark Carlton Smith, General Sir Mark Carlton Smith, on this stage 20 years ago, saying exactly what he said this morning, and we would be in so much better shape. We are horribly behind the drag curve. But just to get the gearing, first point, 7:33 a.m. on the 6th of August, 2013, Mr., as he was then, Donald Trump, now president, tweeted, "Understand the rules of the game in order to play it better." Understand the rules of the game in order to play it better. It's an Albert Einstein quote. What we do, what we've done, is to reinforce the rules of the game. We absolutely reinforce the rules of the game, unless you get somebody like Mark standing up here and saying, think outside. Actually, don't. No box required. Get your gearing up, because the world has changed. Because we have to understand what has changed. And it has changed and then some. Number two, Napoleon Bonaparte. I'm British. Historic enemy, always and forever will be the French. Sorry about that. Yeah. We don't talk about Waterloo. We don't talk about Trafalgar. We don't talk any of these things yet. But he, the emperor, short, a bit like me, made that famous comment once when he said that the moral is to the physical as 3 to 1. The moral is to the physical as 3 to 1. We have spent 3 centuries, not 3 decades, 3 centuries stuck on line and column, fire and movement and maneuver. We have been stuck for 3 centuries and doing it very, very well on force on force. Everything's changed. If you take Fuller, Boney, his 1919 piece, it is absolutely about force on force, and it generated out of the German maneuver of 1918 that which delivered Blitzkrieg and nearly did for us in 1939-1940, was the final part of maneuver. That was the part of the 3rd century. 4th generation warfare, that which I see in every guise, in every way, every day. You got to go to William Lint, Sutton, Schmidt, and Wilson, who wrote a very short piece, 6 pages long, didn't have any answers, just made an observation in 1989. And if you read it and come away, as I did, you conclude that it is not force on force that is the way that we are, or you all are, because I'm no longer, I'll be dead soon and I really don't give a rat's ass. The answer is that you are engaged in warfare. It is force on will. Force on will. It's back to the future stuff. It's how Genghis Khan would have recognized, in fact, how you, in fact, change. So when we talk about whole of government, and that term has been used often this morning, without any problem at all and within a heartbeat, I would dismiss the term and merely remove the W. Whole of government. Because that's how it was. It has got better. But Jesus, it's got so much further to go. You know, the idea of one team, one mission, just not the case. The final and third point is the denied and dangerous environments, which these gentlemen will talk about in detail. Do not assume that it's just that in front of you. The denied and dangerous environments in which you fight morally and physically 3-to-1 is in front of you, to your flanks with your coalition partners, and behind you to the population and politicians that allow you. Because you have to be there. You have to get there. You have to stay there to get on and do what you've been asked to in the first call. So, big issue, big game, big change. And if you don't frame what they're about to say in this wider context, you will merely be reinforcing the rules of the game. Understand them. Eric.
Well, sir, that's quite an opening. If I had fears that heavy lunch is going to put this crowd to sleep, my fears are allayed. So good afternoon, everybody. Sir, CGS, thanks for having us here. It's an honor to come and talk to such a wide gathering of military professionals who don't want to be put into the box that General Lamb just described. To our British hosts, thanks for putting on such a great program here. I had the privilege to drive across town earlier today, and I said to General Jones, I said, if you want to know what applicational land power in a mega city looks like, just come to London when guests arrive. I don't know who the guest is, but I don't think it's me. We're going to talk about this fighting in a denied and dangerous environment. And thank you for the illusion or the description of a changed world. And up front, I'll just tell you, I think we've been here before. The last time we were in a position where we had a changing environment, NATO came together in a way that was unprecedented in establishing air-land battle of a way of fighting. In a few short years, in a decade, the world changed. There's a fall of the wall, et cetera. So while the world changes, this group and this community has the capacity to then, therefore, change the world again. And that's what we're in the business of doing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about multi-domain operations. General Milley, Chief of Staff of the Army, just recently signed the U.S. and multi-domain operations in 2028. I do have a few slides for you in true Pentagon form, but I only have about 4 of them, and I won't beat you with them, and you can just follow along as I go, because the things I will talk about will reflect what's in there. If the world's changed, the question becomes, what problem are we trying to solve? And I think that's a good start point for all of us to try to frame the problem in order to determine how we reconcile it. And we think, as we looked at multi-domain operations and this new concept that drives the change of the U.S. Army and likely others, is there are really 3 fundamental things that have changed as we've looked at the world and assessed it. And the first one is that we are being contested in all domains. Now, we say that a lot, and that's probably a common phrase, and we're getting used to it. We don't want our eyes to glaze over, because the reason it's important is that we've been lulled into a certain sense of confidence that won't exist when we in the future engage a peer adversary. So we've been lulled into a certain sense of confidence. For example, the idea of air superiority and the idea of air supremacy. And I always say that the American way of war, when we identify an opponent, is we identify an opponent, a timeline, an APOD, and we use that APOD freely and move at will, establish a framework for some kind of intervention, and then on our timeline, we conduct our operations. And with a peer adversary, that won't be the way it is in the future. So that's a fundamental problem. Secondly, and this is most important as it relates to the physics of the concept, we will deal with peer adversaries that have built in multiple layers of standoff. So our peers watched us in 1991, they watched us in 2003, and here's what they've concluded. They've concluded that they want no part of close combat with the United States, the United Kingdom, and our partners and allies. And because of that, they've invested in things in order to keep us at bay so that we can't get into a close fight with them. So you wonder why the A2AD problem exists. It's because of that multiple layers of standoff. But I would argue that it doesn't just, it's not just in the physical. And I think this is some of the part that General Lamb was alluding to. It's in the social and it's in the political. In fact, we've seen incidents just recently in both the United States and the United Kingdom that were political incidents that were influenced by investment in social media and the political sphere, all designed to bifurcate the unity that comes with Western democratic nations when they collaborate. And if they can fracture that unity, that's the first layer of standoff. But it moves in, and it also includes long-range precision fires and sophisticated IAD systems, et cetera, that we've all talked about. The third area, the third problem that we are faced with is this idea of our peer adversaries leveraging the competition space to achieve operational and strategic objectives. And the problem is that Western democratic nations are not comfortable with this. Western democratic nations, when we're dealing with the military, usually they have a very high threshold before we leverage our military, and therefore don't find ourselves actively engaged in the competition space because our body politic finds it unattractive. So this idea of contested all domains, multiple layers of standoff, and the leveraging of competition space has resulted in one thing, and that is diluted deterrence. Our deterrence capacity, if we're interested in shaping our own strategic and operational objectives or deterring those who would have ill will towards us, has been diluted. So what's the solution? We think that there are 5 problems the Joint Combined Force has to solve. And you see there on the chart that's up there on the top, it talks about the multiple layers of standoff, and you see them demonstrated. But the 5 problems you have to solve in order to reconcile this, number 1 is we have to be able to be willing to compete left of conflict, and by that I mean include not just the interagency, but the uniformed military. And there's 3 parts to that competition. The first is countering unconventional and information warfare. The second would be to prep the operational environment. Now this one's important for the uniformed military because if we're going to go to the next problem, that is to be able to rapidly penetrate this standoff, you have to be actively engaged in the operational preparation of the environment. That is actively targeting. In the 1980s, when we were up against significant Soviet forces, we knew that we had to defeat the second echelon and fight outnumbered and win. And with satellite photos, you could determine based on their garrison what kind of order of battle you're up against. In this environment, we're not up against an order of battle that's designed or defined by formations or echelons, but rather systems and nodes that have to be stimulated so that we can see them, so that we can target them, so if we fail in the competition space, we can rapidly transition to conflict and disintegrate those nodes. When you say disintegrate up there, it doesn't mean atomize by any means. It means to disintegrate the integrated systems of their A2AD and IAD systems so very rapidly you can exploit to enable our own strategic and operational objectives. Now, General Wolf said something earlier today. He said in the competition space and in deterrence, you have to be able to pay to play. And I would define paying in the competition space a little differently than maybe what we would be thinking about in terms of dollars, but we have to be willing to pay in terms of risk. Because if you're going to play in the competition space, there is going to be fratricide, virtual and otherwise. Because if you imagine that you are countering social media, countering in cyber, targeting every single day, then you're going to have some fratricide that will have costs. Will either have to be underwritten by senior political leadership or uniformed military will have to take the risk to enable it. I want to quickly talk about 3 tenets to achieve this. These are tenets of an army that needs to be able to operate in this space. The first is calibrated force posture. In order to compete and actively target so that you can rapidly transition if necessary, you have to be present. And the reliance on expeditionary mobility and tip fids won't work if you want to expand the competition space and also rapidly transition to conflict to defeat a fait accompli attack. We talk about dynamic force posture in our national defense strategy. With this concept, we talk about four things: forward positioning, permanent or otherwise, access to, or rather expeditionary capacity, access to national assets, and increased authorities for uniformed military to compete left of conflict. The second is multi-domain formations, and those that, some will say, well, you can't maneuver satellites at the battalion level. No, you can't, but you need to be able to think, access, and employ all domains in order to create overmatch. So multi-domain formations. And then finally, this idea of convergence. And you see it in some of your documents. What this is the ability for the joint and combined force to integrate all domains continually and rapidly with redundancy. Because if you're challenged in all domains, you can, the left two columns talk about the way we've been doing things the last 30 years. The center column talks about the idea of creating overmatch by the total is greater than the sum of the parts. But if you just have an exquisite kill chain and we are countered in all domains, it can be easily defeated. So you need an ability to have redundancy in the integration of all of these domains in order to create overmatch at decisive space. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop there and hand it back over to the chair, but I'll just finish with this. We're currently losing market share, and I'm convinced that when we look to the future and we look back at this time, the decisions we make now as a joint and combined set of forces will determine the degree to which we regain the market share we lose absent change. I look forward to your questions.
God, I love that. Eric, thanks. No, that was, because normally old Americans throw out the PowerPoints, but no, that was, no. That was to borrow a sort of Kung Fu Panda phrase, totally awesome. I just raised one point out really, which is the part that the big takeaway for me is we talk about adaptability, talk about agility, and you absolutely nailed it, which is if you have not thought, the assumption that an opportunity presents itself, you have to be able to see it, and then you've got to secondly seize it. And if you haven't done the work on formation structures, training, education, keep ticking the damn list off to be able to seize it, you will have no time to do it, and you'll be screwed and stuck forever in a double jeopardy. Brilliantly done. Thanks, Eric. All right.
I apologize. I'll go to
Yeah, of course, my friend.
Thank you for the kind invitation and for setting this amazing opportunity for knowledge sharing across the board and the camaraderie and partnership between armies. I think it's a great opportunity. A few things before I go into the presentation to say about the framework that was put here. First thing, one thing I think will not change. The chaotic nature of war will stay. No matter how much we'll try to organize it, to use data, to use everything, that will remain. The second thing is the demand to achieve the war goals with fewer casualties and to end it faster is constantly rising by our nations. Thirdly, the enemy we are facing is not some scattered terrorists and also not the nation's army, it's a terror military. Therefore, rules of engagement apply differently to us and to the adversaries. And the change that is needed is big, and I think the biggest threat to the change needed is us, experienced military officers with a lot of experience. As Darwin said, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. Speaking about the denied and dangerous environment, dangerous is a matter of concept. One could argue that me standing here while my wife is traveling through the streets of London, doing shopping, trying to enforce the British economy is dangerous. But so try to understand, to frame what we are saying about the complexity of the battlefield, the first thing is I want to elaborate on what the enemy has done to reduce our combat superiority. He is embedded much more into urban areas, into cities, and operates out of underground infrastructure, making it harder to spot and effectively target. More so when it is using the human population as human shield. The second thing I want to emphasize is EW. EW used to be very expensive, very demanding to exploit. All you need now is an eBay, Amazon, or AliExpress account and $9.99 in the bank account, and you can buy a GPS blocker, which is fairly easy to use. And we lose small aircraft, small UAVs to that. The same applies to drones and UAVs with a simple detachment devices or suicide UAVs. This makes the battlefield much more demanding. And of course, the regular A2AD, thousands of rockets, missiles, and IEDs truly creates the fighting zone a denied one and very difficult to operate in. So, a few steps in engaging that. I think the first one to solve this complex equation is to locate the enemy. Using all available spectrum, the multispectral picture now helps detecting things we couldn't see with just one. The second thing is using every platform, land or air, so we sensorize the battlefield, and there will be all sensor carriers. Technology helps us a lot to minimize the size of the sensors and to maximize their efficiency. Motion detection is here, spectrum analyzer is here, and much more. Lastly, the enemy understands all that, and unfortunately does not cooperate with us. So we have to execute maneuver concepts, forcing them to change and react. So basically the standoff that Eric spoke about is used by the enemy, and we have to move him from where he stands. Usually that can only be conducted by going into the battlefield. The second most important thing, I think, is network. One of the biggest technology opportunities is the fusion of data that is generated separately in the battlefield. The easiest explanation I can do to that is the Waze application, which we once navigated with books. Now I think no one has that in the car. When I was a young officer, I got it as a present from the IDF. Now we don't give that anymore. But also, the easiest dimension to interrupt, partly or completely. And we think of different concepts to immune the network. The first one, to make it robust. Multiple hubs, cognitively expanded and shrinks, built bottom up and top down. Multi-layered, so the network of networks formatted from all sides. And multi-band, just straightforward to go on a wider spectrum premises. And finally, to encrypt it and to generate gateways and firewalls so we can protect the network from inside. If we're successful creating an immune network, I think then the sky is the limit. A little bit of technology was discussed before. Think of the idea of get taxi applied to get bomb. Basically, you're a platoon commander or a company commander. You place a target on the network, and you get the most right or the most suitable bomb to that mission. Or think of the option to bring the targets into the sniper telescope inside. Augmented reality is already here, and it's easy to use and to exploit. And of course, AI and BI, getting much more from big data and raw data, it is very easy to use. But technology is not enough. I wrote the BCT++, meaning we need to do combined arms and joint branch warfare as deep as we can. We build them from company up, combined arms, tanks, infantry, engineers, and more, and one have to try to exercise it in order to exploit it efficiently on the battlefield. And using joint capabilities to the tactical forces, multi-domain, that is very important. If we could do all that, then maybe we can have a very high tempo of operation, winning the learning competition by not giving the enemy time to recover, operate on a higher rate than the enemy. Of course, one will need a lot of core capabilities. I will not go through all of them. Of course, not all of them technologies, but concepts of operating. Two things I would like to emphasize within that. First of all is protection systems. We used a lot of platform-based protection systems, which is very useful to the platform that carries that. But we now also think of an aerial protection system which will bring protection for the battalion or for the brigade when operates in the field, a system of systems that first threat detection, detect the threat, then tracking and estimating where it is going to hit, and then, of course, neutralize by intercepting or by hitting the launcher. Of course, we think exploiting robotics in the BCT is a very important thing that can save the price of war and maximize our efficiency and maybe the surprise element when used correctly. So I think to conclude this short presentation is if we do all these things, it would be not easier, but more effective to operate on the battlefield. Thank you.
Again, you know, what leaps out from that is you look at the level of sophistication, the innovation and integration of what the IDF against, near peer, sub-peer, not even near peer, at all peer. 2004, 2006, General Stan McChrystal in his book, Team of Teams, looks at AQI in Iraq fighting against JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, and his view at that time was we were losing. With none of the sophistication, none of the systems that were available, they were losing. So when we talk about near peer, don't look necessarily just at the Russians. Don't just look at, in effect, what I call whoever else may be out there in your space. Actually, every mother is near peer. Thanks. James.
Thanks very much, General. CGS Director General, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And I would like to start by thanking General Lamb and my fellow panelists, General Wesley and Brigadier General Gordin, for their insightful comments. I have been asked to talk about fighting dispersed, and I think what I have to say chimes very much with the themes that have already been discussed. And the experience of developing the British Army's strike capability and concept has very much convinced me that the ability to fight dispersed is increasingly non-discretionary if our formations are to survive and prosper on the 21st century battlefield. Why? Well, firstly, our potential opponents have capabilities which absolutely punish persistent concentrations of force in ways which I don't believe we can absorb or sustain. And secondly, fighting dispersed provides opportunities for decisive action that could otherwise be pretty difficult to come by. It allows for levels of infiltration, penetration, and unpredictability that can decisively threaten a peer opponent's command and control, his echelon forces, and of course his logistics elements, what one might describe as dislocation at scale. However, fighting at scale, fighting dispersed, undoubtedly comes with significant challenges related to achieving and maintaining the degree of dispersal required, as well as converging and concentrating effects in pursuit of a decision. And that's the fundamental issue. So what are we talking about when one talks about fighting dispersed? In our experimentation, we have been working with brigade frontages of 80 to 100 kilometers in width and brigade depths of up to 100 kilometers beyond the traditional FIBA, if that concept still has relevance. We've assumed operational marches of up to 2,000 kilometers and the ability to operate tactically on up to 12 axes of advance or investment, with subunits dispersed well beyond the confines of a kilometer grid square in order to reduce their vulnerability to mass fires. But it is difficult to infer or colorize much from those figures. So in the short time available, I want to raise 3 component priorities of fighting dispersed, which time and again seem to rise to the surface as central tenets requiring attention. First and foremost, our experimentation has confirmed the non-discretionary nature of agile and resilient command and control in fighting dispersed. And it remains my #1 capability development priority for the future Strike Brigade. This is because it is common to all COAs. It's agnostic of capabilities, structures, or platforms. And in the complex battle space of the information age, I believe command and control is the critical capability without which we will not be able to exploit our traditional strengths of the maneuverist approach. Accordingly, within our strike experimentation, we have had to adapt our command and control structures, seeking agility by conducting dispersed collaborative working between several lean forward command posts rather than a single one, and with scenarios in which we have ended up controlling brigade operations with a command post of 12 personnel or fewer for significant periods of time. In order to enhance our survivability, and I know others have done this as well, we have also experimented with controlling overseas expeditionary operations from a rear-based command post in the UK, exploiting reach back and as near to a universal common operating picture as our current technology allows. But we have in no way reached our potential regarding command and control, and we're missing a few things too. For example, and it's already been spoken about, the universal digitization of command support tools, and vitally, that open architecture, communication and information systems, which when combined with spiral development, including machine learning, ensure that our hardware will not become the limiting factor over time. And clearly the arrival of BSIP 5.6 made strides towards this, and the ongoing innovation to deliver the 21st century headquarters under the Army's transformation program is also very welcome. But there is more to do. However, I don't want to conclude or confuse the pursuit of a more effective and resilient command tools with greater centralization. That's not what we're talking about here. Mission command in fighting dispersed is as central and valid as ever, particularly for fighting dispersed, I would argue. And to assure it requires high fidelity and low latency rich data systems right down to the sub-unit level. Methods for delivering this, we know, include hotspot and other multiple bearer technologies to assure access and resilience. But our aim must always be to create a sufficiently rich and resilient system that allows us to withstand the inevitable gaps in communications that will be presented by an EMS contested and widely dispersed battlefield. So to cap the point, and if I were asked now the direct question, I would argue that agile and resilient command and control is the greater part of the answer as to how one converges meaningful effects whilst operating dispersed. The second priority in strike is lethality. And the tension inherent in fighting dispersed whilst manifesting meaningful effects is self-evident. Concentration invites vulnerability, and the corollary of the force characteristics that privileges one's ability to fight dispersed, so let's say mobility, as in the case of a medium force like strike, the corollary seems to be an inherent lack of punch. And what we have found is that to fight dispersed, you need to ensure you are competitive with, not necessarily superior to, heavier forces to be able to maneuver into a position of advantage without being defeated. To that end, throughout our experimentation, we have had to, and to give a low-level tactical example, we have had to consistently privilege anti-armor capabilities across the brigade in the form of organic, mounted and dismounted anti-tank guided weapons in every platoon and troop, as well as some CSS elements. In both simulation and war games, this has enabled the Strike Brigade to survive, operate, and win as both a covering and an exploitation force. But successful dispersal also requires a peerless ability to leverage joint fires from positions of advantage gained through rapid maneuver, as General Wesley has already alluded to. At the brigade level, organic fires, ostensibly in the form of close support artillery and battle group mortars, are currently limited to under 30 kilometers in range. And we know that the next generation of IDF technology, that's indirect fire rather than our Israeli counterparts, will over double that. But technology is only part of the answer, not least due to the fact that it is obviously available to our prospective opponents as well. To achieve, for example, in our experimentation, effective counter-battery fires in order to survive, we have found it necessary to fight artillery differently and to consistently group close support artillery with our maneuver battle groups. This has been complemented on a recent exercise, joint warfighting assessments in the United States, by access to long-range divisional and multi-domain joint fires, which has enabled the Strike Brigade to act as an effective vector for delivering both divisional and core deep effects. But we also need to, as has been alluded to institutionally reframe our understanding of the relationship between lethal and non-lethal effects. And despite many years of exhorting non-lethal effects, I think we are still really poor at articulating and codifying the tactical actions and the tasks that deliver them in warfighting at scale. As outlined by General Wesley, multi-domain operations now provides us with an opportunity and a framework to change this. In the information, SEMA, and space domains, immediate effects may not be explicitly lethal, but their catalyzing impacts absolutely are. The bottom line is that at every level, we need to be more lethal than we currently are, and this in turn will enhance our survivability. I reserve my final point for the golden thread running through all of the experimentation theses and validations, the training gap for fighting dispersed, and many have mentioned it already. As we grapple with the challenges of peer opponents in a contemporary operating environment, the temptation is to focus on technology to solve our problems. That is understandable, and of course technology and innovation are hugely important. However, from interoperability through the tactical confidence required to thrive in a dispersed battle space, in the Strike Brigade we have found that training remains the keystone challenge of the future capability development. Indeed, I've watched with interest the occasional extreme discomfort of our junior commanders when, in both virtual and live training exercises, they have been put in positions of dispersed isolation. And I would say that the soldier's fear of having a flank turned or being cut off from his lines of communication is natural. It's as old as time, it is almost atavistic. But overcoming this, which I believe we need to, will require no less than cultural change. And if we wish to secure a competitive advantage that this conference is speaking to, we must exploit the qualitative advantage our people can bestow on our armies. And training is the principal methodology for investing in that advantage. And I would reflect on CGS's comments this morning about gaining our asymmetric advantage. Not least, we require to engender a martial ethos that allows us to fight dispersed, rewire some of our tactical risk calculi, because ultimately it will be our greater comfort with the challenges that such a battle space presents relative to our opponents that will dictate our success. As one superior officer who might just now command the British Army used to exhort us as junior commanders, a good commander lets the enemy worry about his flanks. Significantly greater volumes of training will be required to achieve the necessary level of mastery, and I know this is currently under examination through the Army's Collective Training Transformation Programme. So, in summary, there is still much work to be done refining and defining the requirements of fighting dispersed. To emphasize Ewan Lawson's point earlier, our next critical piece of work has got to be how we sustain this fight at reach to allow us to exploit deep maneuver. Our early findings suggest significant transformation is required, from how we deliver trade training through to an overhaul of battlefield medical policy, for example. However, like the adoption of multi-domain operations, I assess that this transformation is non-discretionary. From a land maneuver perspective, fighting dispersed may be the only way we can offer a sufficiently low or disaggregated force profile to penetrate an A-to-AD bubble and begin the process of its disintegration. In this, the land component must be able to offer the joint commander viable options. In the Strike Brigade and our experimentation thus far, our experience leads us to conclude that fighting dispersed successfully requires a greater cultural and institutional shift than might at first seem obvious, but one that I assess is necessary in developing an effective and sustainable future approach to warfighting. General Graeme, CGS, on that note, I conclude, and I also assume on that note, star rescinded. Thank you very much.
James, nicely done. I mean, I'll do what I've done with both the other speakers, which is an interesting. James almost raises a question for me, which I'm not sure I have an answer to. I have no doubt that those 38 nations that are here represented, the men and women will, as they have done in the past, be very comfortable with standing into harm's way. Just goes with the uniform, really, doesn't it? And the fact you're getting paid. The problem I see is a world which is increasingly risk-averse. Actually, in fact, I would say nowadays, increasingly the bar is set at who to blame, which is very, very low. And therefore, the battle space for CGS in many ways and CDS is actually to the political and the public space to see whether you can get that level of risk, that level of blame, mitigated to be able to do exactly what James described. The second point I'd say is this idea of command and control is critical to the delivery of effect, or words to that effect. I remember in 2007, General Mattis, when I was doing some work on the Joe with him, concluded in a small finding at the end and said, what is the greatest threat to the United States of America armed forces at that time? And his view was digital dependence. So the threat of losing that, and therefore being able to do mission command, in command, out of control, all of that requires, again, a sort of level of education and training. But again, James, thanks very much indeed.